Today, hundreds of millions of people live outside their home countries. Some are fleeing war or poverty, others are chasing a better quality of life, more stability, or simply safer surroundings. Globalization has made movement between countries more active than at any point in the last few centuries. And the sheer availability of information means people now have a much clearer picture of where life might be better than back home. But moving hundreds of millions of people around creates enormous challenges for dozens of countries. And migration has become one of the defining issues of the 21st century. So in this video, we're going to talk about global migration, why it happens, how it developed, why it sparks so much controversy, and where this whole trend is actually taking us. Now, migration itself is nothing new. It's been a constant throughout human history, with each era having its own unique character and drivers. Take the Great Migration period in Europe, which ran roughly from the 3rd to the 8th century AD. It completely reshuffled the political landscape of the continent, redrew borders, and brought waves of new peoples into territories they'd never occupied before. The whole thing was set off by the Hunnic invasion from Asia, which pushed numerous tribes westward, right up against Rome's borders. That pressure became one of the factors that finished off the already crumbling Western Roman Empire and kicked off a total redrawing of Europe's political map. Estimates of how many people were on the move vary quite a bit, anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million. But for the time, that was a staggering number, given that Europe's total population was only around 30 million. Then there's a completely different kind of migration, one that went out of Europe, which took off with the Age of Discovery. Once the Americas were on the map, European colonizers set sail to conquer new lands and settle them. At first, it wasn't particularly massive in scale: temporary settlements, trading outposts, expeditions for gold and silver, that kind of thing. But over time, the flow picked up, and the New World started offering enormous opportunities for settlers. The 13 colonies that eventually became the United States were founded by families fleeing religious persecution and grinding poverty. The new lands offered more freedom and fertile soil, and that's what pulled people across the ocean in growing numbers. The colonization of the Americas literally changed the entire course of world history, gave birth to dozens of new nations across 2 continents, and the role the United States has played in global history since then, well, it's hard to overstate. The second major wave of European emigration to the New World began in the early 19th century and ran right up to World War I. In the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1914, something like 50 to 60 million people left Europe. Most headed to North America, though South America and Australia also received substantial numbers, and there was a separate phenomenon of mass settlement of Siberia from the European part of Russia. By that point, Europe was becoming overpopulated, and recurring wars and conflicts pushed people to seek out new territories. That wave of migration is precisely what drove the explosive population growth in the New World, giving those countries a significant advantage in the century to come. The 20th century in Europe isn't just defined by 2 world wars. It's also defined by massive waves of forced migration that those wars produced. After World War I, one of the most striking phenomena was what became known as the White Emigration. Several million people fled the territory of the former Russian Empire after the Bolsheviks took power, scattering across Europe, the United States, and China. The Russian diaspora became a fascinating historical phenomenon. For decades, these communities existed in almost complete isolation from their homeland. Another major forced population movement was the so-called Greek-Turkish population exchange, which began in 1923. In what was essentially state-organized deportation, both countries expelled their national minorities across the border. Greeks and Turks were uprooted from lands they'd inhabited for generations, as both newly formed nation-states tried to eliminate the threat of separatism within their borders. Around 2 million people went through this process. After World War II, the scale of population transfers became even larger and affected a number of European peoples. The biggest by far was the expulsion of ethnic Germans from other countries. Mass deportations from Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Hungary, where Germans had historically lived in significant numbers. On top of that, German territory itself was drastically reduced, and Germans were pushed out of lands that had previously been part of Germany. These deportations were directly tied to the nationalist ideology that had started the war in the first place. Hitler had marched to protect German populations living abroad. The end result, up to 15 million Germans were expelled from countries across Europe. There were also population exchanges between Poland and the Soviet Union, forcing the resettlement of Poles, Belarusians, and Ukrainians who had lived in those areas for centuries. Poland separately carried out Operation Vistula against its Ukrainian population, forcibly relocating them to the newly acquired Western territories that had been taken from Germany, the idea being to assimilate the Ukrainians and reduce separatist pressure in eastern Poland. All of these processes were brutal and came at a devastating human cost. So as you can see, migration has existed in one form or another throughout all of human history, but the speed and scale of movement today is on a completely different level. So why has migration exploded so dramatically in recent decades? There are a lot of reasons, and one of the biggest is globalization. Technology has made it dramatically easier to move between countries and even continents. Information about any corner of the world is right there in your pocket. Language learning has become accessible to the masses, and the practical logistics of migration have been simplified in countless ways. The primary driver, though, remains economic, and that's what pushes people from poorer regions like Africa or the Middle East toward Europe, from Latin America toward the United States, from Laos or the Philippines toward Taiwan or Singapore. Economic motivation for migration has always been powerful. As we said, the colonization of the New World was largely driven by it. But back then, the barriers were incomparably higher, and the role of information access can't be overstated. In the past, most people had no idea what life looked like in other countries, so they had no particular reason to go. Today, virtually anyone on the planet can look up what life is like somewhere else and decide to head there. War, conflict, and humanitarian disasters are a separate major driver. The biggest migration crises Europe has faced in recent years were directly tied to major wars on its doorstep. The Syrian civil war and the war in Ukraine. Security concerns can be an even stronger pull than economic ones, and Europe has positioned itself as a guarantor of safety for people fleeing violence. A reflection of the humanist values that are deeply embedded in European civilization. Demographic imbalances between countries also fuel migration and create incentives on both sides of the equation. Here's what I mean. The wealthy global north, Europe, the US, Japan, and similar countries, has long been in the phase of aging societies. Populations are getting older, birth rates are falling, and the pressure on social systems is growing as the ratio of pensioners to workers increases. These countries genuinely need labor and new residents. Meanwhile, the so-called Global South, most of Africa and much of Asia, is still in the middle of a demographic boom. High birth rates, young populations, and not enough jobs to go around. To put some numbers on it, Germany's median age is 46.8 years, Pakistan's is 22.9, Italy's is 48.4, while neighboring Libya, just across the Mediterranean, sits at 26.2. And the world's youngest countries are even more extreme. In Angola, Mali, and Uganda, the median age hovers around 16 years old. The gap is enormous, and it creates a natural pull from young, populous countries toward aging, labor-starved ones that actually serves both sides' interests. Climate change is also increasingly pushing people out of regions that are becoming harder to live in. The Sahel zone in Africa is a prime example. Summers are getting more brutal, and the people there, who depend overwhelmingly on agriculture, are leaving en masse because the land simply isn't producing anymore. That creates additional migration flows, both within countries and across borders. In 2015, Europe faced a migration challenge that ultimately triggered a crisis within the EU itself. Mass migration into Europe came through three main routes: across Turkey to the Greek islands, especially Lesbos, which sits right off the Turkish coast, then up through the Balkans into Central Europe, across the Mediterranean from Libya and Tunisia, usually aiming for the island of Lampedusa, which was the most dangerous route due to the distances involved, and through Morocco into Spain, either across the Strait of Gibraltar or through Spain's African enclaves of Ceuta and Melilla. Yes, Spain still has territory on the African continent. Over the course of that year, more than 1 million migrants arrived in Europe, the vast majority staying within EU borders and moving north from their initial entry points. Europe had never received a refugee influx on that scale, and it exposed deep divisions between member states, triggered social unrest, and generated intense public debate. The internal EU crisis was serious. Italy and Greece bore the heaviest burden. Greece alone saw roughly 80% of all arrivals pass through it, and its infrastructure was under record-breaking strain. Some Western countries, like Germany and Sweden, adopted a policy of full openness and accepted record numbers of refugees, even though this technically violated EU rules, specifically the Dublin Regulation, which requires asylum seekers to apply in the first safe country they reach. Several Western nations essentially chose to ignore that principle, which did help relieve Greece and Italy. Meanwhile, a third bloc of countries, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic, took a hard anti-immigration stance, flat out refusing to comply with EU directives on refugee distribution. Hungary even built a border fence to stop migrants moving through the Balkans from entering its territory. Outside the EU, Turkey became a major pressure point. It was the main transit route for the flow. In 2016, Turkey agreed to crack down on crossings in exchange for financial transfers from the EU, which significantly reduced the numbers. The political fallout across Europe was substantial. Right-wing and conservative parties began gaining real traction. Germany's AfD, one of the country's most popular parties today, started its major growth during this period, riding largely on an anti-immigration platform. In France, Marine Le Pen's party strengthened its position and became the main challenger to the establishment in multiple electoral cycles. In Austria, Italy, and the Netherlands, right-wing conservatives eventually took power outright. Italy still has a right-wing coalition in government today, as do several Scandinavian countries. The crisis also changed how Schengen works in practice. Countries began reimposing border controls, which directly undermines the core idea of the agreement. And those temporary controls have become something of a recurring feature ever since. The debate between those who support migration and those who oppose it is still raging today, across Europe and beyond. Supporters argue that migration is simply necessary given the demographic crisis facing developed countries. It fills labor shortages across the whole spectrum, from delivery drivers and cleaning staff all the way up to IT specialists, doctors, and engineers. Migration stimulates the broader economy and helps keep social systems funded. Migrants work, pay taxes, and contribute to pension systems that would otherwise be under even greater pressure. Supporters also point to cultural enrichment, the diversity that migration brings to cities, new cuisines, new ideas, new forms of culture. Cities like New York, London, and Singapore have become global hubs precisely because of their multicultural character. And there's the humanitarian dimension too. For many Europeans, helping people fleeing war, famine, or disaster is a moral responsibility, not just a political question. Critics, on the other hand, argue that large-scale immigration creates real problems. A sudden influx of people puts pressure on housing, healthcare, schools, and public transport, making them more expensive or lower quality for people who were already there. Government budgets have to expand to cover the needs of new arrivals, which affects everyone. And integration is a genuine challenge. Rapid influxes can create entire ethnic neighborhoods that effectively become closed-off communities, sometimes turning into areas with higher crime rates and social tensions. Right-wing conservatives also make an identity-based argument that mass immigration dilutes national culture and identity, and that the role of the state is to protect its own people first, which means strict borders and tight immigration controls. And honestly, both sides have a point. Migration creates real opportunities and real challenges. The job of any government is to find the right balance, one that maximizes the benefits while minimizing the problems. So what happens next? There are a few scenarios worth thinking about. Scenario 1, isolationism wins. Right-wing parties sweep to power across Europe and the broader developed world. We're already seeing elements of this. In the US, Trump won in 2024 and moved aggressively against illegal immigration. Raids, visa cuts, tighter border enforcement, and the chilling effect of making clear that undocumented migrants had no future in the country under his administration. Similar right-wing coalitions are in place in Italy, Finland, and elsewhere. If this trend continues, borders close and migration slows dramatically, helped along by increasingly sophisticated surveillance and detection technology. The migration problem gets managed, but a new one takes its place. Who pays for the pensions of an aging population with no new workers coming in? Scenario 2. Manage migration. The pragmatic middle ground. Countries implement strict quota systems based on actual economic needs, bringing in workers for specific sectors, calibrating the numbers to what the labor market and social infrastructure can absorb, without blowing up housing costs for existing residents. Canada and Australia already use something like this, a points-based system that prioritizes applicants based on skills and qualifications. Low-skilled labor can be brought in on temporary contracts with no path to permanent residency, similar to how Gulf countries structure their migrant worker programs. It's not glamorous, but it might be the most sustainable approach. Scenario 3. Uncontrolled migration triggered by a new global crisis. Entering the 2020s has already proven brutally complicated for the world. The sheer number of major events in just a few years has been staggering, and global politics keeps moving toward escalation. Major wars in various regions will inevitably produce refugee flows that no border fence can fully stop. If conflicts continue to spread, we could be talking about tens of millions of potential refugees on the move simultaneously. The UN is already modeling scenarios around climate migration. What happens if parts of the Sahel, where hundreds of millions of people live, become truly uninhabitable? Similar pressures are building in parts of Asia and Latin America. That kind of crisis wouldn't be manageable through normal policy tools. To wrap up, migration isn't just about foreign nationals showing up on your doorstep. It's a question about the future of a country, about national identity and culture, about economics, about human rights. The intensification of migration throws up serious challenges, but it also creates real opportunities. How countries navigate that tension is going to be one of the defining stories of our time.